They mocked the temp doctor's hair until a war veteran saw her in a hospital lobby and broke down in tears saying the words no one there was ready to hear. She saved my entire unit. Most people think judgment starts with cruelty. It doesn't. It starts with a glance, a smirk, a whispered joke in a bright hallway before sunrise when coffee is hot, scrubs are clean, and nobody knows the scar hidden beneath a woman's hair. At Granite Ridge Medical Center in Denver, Dr. Rowan Hale walked in like any other replacement surgeon. By noon, the rumors had already outrun her name. But this is not just a story about mockery. It is about trauma, silent survival, and the price of carrying pain no one can see. Stay with me to the end then. Like the video and comment where you're watching from. To understand why a veteran would look at Dr. Rowan Hale and fall apart in a hospital lobby, you have to go back 3 mornings to the hour. Denver was still blue with cold, and the city had not fully decided to wake. Granite Ridge Medical Center stood on the edge of downtown like a clean, white promise. 12 stories of glass, steel, and polished stone reflecting the first thin stripe of dawn. Inside, the place already hummed with the quiet machinery of people trying to keep death on a schedule. Elevators sighed open. Phones chirped. Rubber soles whispered across waxed floors. Somewhere deep in the building, an alarm pulsed once and went silent. The smell was coffee bleach hand soap, and that faint metallic chill hospitals seemed to trap in their walls no matter the season. At exactly 6 o'clock, the front doors parted, and Rowan stepped inside. She wore navy scrubs beneath a charcoal coat and carried a leather credential folder tucked close under one arm. She did not look around the way most temporary doctors did on their first day, measuring exits, reading signs, deciding whether this place might be kind or cold. She moved with the focus of someone who already knew the answer and had made peace with it. Straight spine, even stride, chin level, no wasted motion. A volunteer at the front desk started to offer directions, then paused when she saw Rowan's hair. Most people did. On the left, it fell in a dark wave just past her shoulder. On the right, it was clipped close to the scalp. Not rebellious, not careless, deliberate, sharp, a choice that made strangers think they were owed an explanation. The volunteer recovered first. "Can I help you?" Dr. Rowan Hale. "Surgical locum, I'm expected." The woman nodded too quickly and reached for the visitor log, though Rowan did not need one. She had already been cleared. Temporary ID, electronic badge, privilege packet. The kind of paperwork that made a person official without making them belong. By the time Rowan crossed the lobby, a transporter near the elevators had already looked twice. A nurse with an overnight chart pressed to her chest had glanced up from her phone, blinked, then angled her body toward another nurse just enough to whisper. Rowan felt every look. She had long ago learned how not to react to them. She reached the surgical floor at 6:10. The corridor lights were brighter there, reflecting off glassed-in stations and brushed steel cabinets. Monitors cast green pulses in dim rooms. The day shift had not fully taken over yet, so the hospital existed in that in-between hour when fatigue and urgency shared the same air. At the end of the hall, outside the chief's office, Dr. Everett Sloan stood with a paper coffee cup in one hand and a tablet in the other. Mid-50s, trim silver hair, navy tie loosened just enough to suggest he had been there all night, or had not really gone home. He looked up as Rowan approached, and for one brief second his eyes stalled. Not on her face, on the shaved side of her head. He masked it quickly. Men like Sloan had spent decades perfecting that kind of small control. "Dr. Hale, Dr. Sloan," he offered his hand. His grip was firm, professional, distracted. Rowan saw the quick measuring scan behind his expression. Not hostile. Evaluating. "You found us without trouble." "Yes, sir." The word slipped out on reflex, clean and automatic. His brows shifted a fraction. Rowan let go of his hand. "Dr. Sloan." He took a sip of coffee, studying her over the rim. "Locum trauma coverage for 3 weeks. General surgery backup where needed. We move quickly around here." "I do too." A corner of his mouth almost moved. I gathered. He turned and gestured for her to follow. "You'll cover while Dr. Adler is out. Mostly trauma overflow emergency surgery, whatever breaks loose on a given day. We are not trying to reinvent the department." "Good," Rowan said. "Neither am I." That answer landed in the corridor and stayed there. Sloan walked. Rowan kept pace. They passed glass rooms, scrub bays, supply closets, nurses already deep in the first arguments of the morning. On a whiteboard near OR3, someone had listed the day's cases in blue marker: cholecystectomy, bowel obstruction, splenic laceration observation. One appendectomy squeezed between larger cases like a small task that could not possibly grow teeth. As they moved through, the wing staff nodded to Sloan. A few looked past him at Rowan, then looked away, too late. One resident in maroon scrubs came out of the call room carrying a stack of imaging films, saw Rowan, and almost walked into the doorframe. Sloan noticed everything and commented on nothing. At the resident's lounge, he pushed open the door without knocking. 4 doctors looked up from the conference table. The room smelled like stale coffee printer toner and the tired heat of bodies that had been sitting too long. A caseboard glowed on the far wall. Half-eaten breakfast burritos sat beside anatomy notes and trauma protocols marked with yellow tabs. Sloan spoke first. "Everyone, this is Dr. Rowan Hale. She'll be with us for the next 3 weeks." Names followed in sequence. Dr. Paige Lawson looked the oldest of the residents, early 30s, composed dark hair in a low knot, eyes that watched before they judged. Dr. Tyler Grant had the eager, slightly overextended energy of someone trying to prove he belonged in every room he entered. Dr. Brooke Mercer smiled too brightly, a polished social reflex that could read as warmth or mockery depending on the second. Dr. Nolan Briggs leaned back in his chair with one ankle over the opposite knee, handsome in the loose, careless way some people used as armor. Smart eyes, restless mouth, the kind of confidence that often arrived before competence. Their expressions all followed the same path: professional greeting, recognition of the hair, a flicker of interest. Then that dangerous little light people got when they thought they had found an easy story. Paige stood first. "Welcome to Granite Ridge Drive." "Hale." "Thank you." Brooke tilted her head. "That's a bold look." Rowan set her folder down on the table. "It's hair." Brooke laughed softly as if they were already sharing a joke. "Sure, but it does make an impression. I'm more interested in making the right one in the OR." Silence settled over the table. Tyler looked at the caseboard instead of either woman. Nolan's mouth twitched. Sloan stepped in. "Dr. Hale trained at Walter Reed and has trauma specialization. She'll be joining rounds this morning." There it was. Walter Reed. Tyler's head came up. Paige's eyes sharpened. Nolan said military. Rowan picked up a dry erase marker and faced the board. "Which patient are we worried about first?" She started reading before anyone could decide whether to be annoyed or impressed. 40 minutes later, she knew the floor map, the OR rotation, the names of the scrub nurses most likely to save a surgery before the attending noticed it was drifting, and the fact that Brooke Mercer whispered too much when she thought someone was beneath hearing range. By 7:15, the first whisper reached her in full. They were walking back from pre-op when Brooke bent toward Nolan and said, not quite softly enough, "I mean, come on, there has to be a story there." Nolan kept his voice low. "Bad breakup." Tyler muttered, "Or don't be jerks." Brooke ignored him. "Nobody cuts their hair like that because life is going great." Rowan did not break stride. She had heard versions of that line in airports' hotel bars, clinic hallways, pharmacy queues, and one church parking lot in Virginia, where an old woman had smiled pity into her face and said, "You're too pretty to do that to yourself." People always wanted pain to look graceful if it insisted on surviving. Morning rounds moved quickly. Rowan spoke when she needed to. Not more, not less. She asked sharp questions, read labs without shuffling papers, caught an electrolyte mismatch Tyler had missed, and corrected a dosage calculation with the calm exactness of someone who did not need to raise her voice to take control of a room. The first patient she visited was a retired schoolteacher recovering from a bowel resection. The woman had dry lips, distrustful eyes, and the settled fear of people who knew enough about their own bodies to sense when something was wrong before a monitor confirmed it. Rowan took her hand, checked the incision, listened to her lungs, then looked directly at her. "Your pain is climbing because your abdomen is tightening, not because you're anxious. I'm going to get imaging and stay ahead of it." The woman relaxed on the spot. Not because the news was good, because it was clear. Paige saw it happen. In medicine, patients told you things with their bodies long before they used words. They loosened around competence. They turned toward steadiness the same way flowers leaned toward heat. By 8:10, Rowan was scrubbing for the appendectomy. The patient was 19, college freshman. No prior major medical problems except one abdominal surgery at age 11 that had left a slender vertical scar. Straightforward on paper, The kind of case residents used to reclaim confidence after ugly overnight trauma. Paige stood across from Rowan at the sink, scrubbing in beside her. You really trained at Walter Reed? Yes. Army. Rowan rinsed soap from her forearms. Does it matter? Paige considered that. Depends what you learned there. Rowan took a sterile towel from the tech without looking up. Same thing everyone learns. Blood goes where blood goes. Tissue tears where tissue tears. That is not what everyone learns. No, Rowan said. It isn't. In the operating room, the lights were already up. Stainless trays reflected white. The anesthesiologist checked lines. The monitor beeped in its steady pre-incision rhythm. It should have been simple. It was not. The first few minutes moved as expected. Incision, exposure, careful entry. Then Rowan's left hand stilled for half a beat. Scar tissue, more than the chart suggested. Dense adhesions webbed across the field like old wire. The appendix was tucked behind loops of tissue that had no intention of being moved politely. Paige leaned in. We may need to extend. The scrub nurse glanced toward the door, as if calculating when to call Sloan. Rowan did not look up, no. Paige frowned. No. We go lateral. Stay through the existing opening. That angle is tight. It's still cleaner. Paige hesitated, and in that hesitation lived every rule she had been taught about what a temporary surgeon should and should not attempt in a hospital that did not know her hands. Rowan said retractor. The nurse placed it in her palm. There was a shift in the room that had nothing to do with instruments. Everyone became quieter. The kind of silence that appears when a person is either about to prove everyone wrong or prove them right. Rowan worked, not quickly for the sake of looking fast, efficiently, a centimeter at a time. Gentle, where gentleness mattered, decisive, where hesitation would cause damage. She found a plane through the adhesions as if she had been reading them longer than the rest of the room had known they existed. Her wrist barely moved. Her shoulders remained loose. Her breathing did not change. More suction. The nurse responded. Hold there. Paige held. Rowan freed a band of scar tissue without nicking the bowel beneath it. Paige's eyes widened above her mask. You've done this before. Yes, not in fellowship. Rowan did not answer. The appendix came out clean 20 minutes later. Minimal blood loss. No widened incision. Stable vitals. Closure neat enough to insult sloppy people on principle. As the final dressing was placed, Paige looked at Rowan the way doctors looked at someone who had just redrawn the map they had been using. Where did you learn that approach? Rowan stripped off one glove, then the other. Practice. Paige followed her into the hallway. That was not standard. Number. Was it combat trauma? Rowan handed her the post-operative note. Check on his pain control and recovery. Paige stood there with the paper in her hand, watching Rowan walk away. The gossip shifted after that. Not stopped, shifted. Now the comments carried a second edge. Curiosity sharpened by irritation. The hair remained the easiest target because it was visible and easy to laugh at. But underneath that laughter, something less comfortable had started to grow. Why was a temporary doctor this good? Why did she move like that? Why did she never explain herself? At lunch, Rowan sat alone in a small conference alcove with a vending machine humming beside her and ate half a turkey sandwich she did not taste. From the hallway, she heard Brooke's voice rise and fall, bright with the confidence of someone who mistook being overheard for being interesting. Still think heartbreak? Tyler said. You don't know anything about her. That's my point. Nolan answered from farther away. I checked the system. 18-month gap after fellowship. Brooke lowered her voice, which only made everyone around her listen harder. See, Tyler said. That proves literally nothing. People disappear when something happens. Nolan laughed once. Or when they want the mystery to do the work for them. Rowan set the rest of the sandwich back in its wrapper and threw it away untouched. She was reviewing labs at 1:20 when Sloan appeared in the doorway. Walk with me. He led her down a quieter corridor near the old surgical library, where framed black and white photographs of former department chiefs watched over the present with institutional suspicion. The library itself had become a storage room for archived journals and old trauma mannequins, but the silence still felt academic. Sloan stopped near a window overlooking the ambulance bay. You've made an impression. That was not my goal. Nevertheless, he held up his tablet, not accusatory, just factual. Your file is strong. Walter Reed, trauma fellowship, excellent evaluations, then nothing for 18 months. I had medical leave. What kind of injury takes a surgeon out for that long? Rowan kept her eyes on the bay below where 2 EMTs smoked beside an idling rig before their next call. The wind pushed dust in little circles across the concrete. A significant one. Sloane waited. When she did not continue, he said, "I'm not asking for gossip. I'm asking because I need to know if there is anything that affects your work." Rowan's right hand rose before she could stop it, fingers brushing the short, clipped hair above her ear. The contact was brief, instinctive. She lowered her hand. "My medical clearance is in the file." "It is, and I'm fully fit to practice. Your skills say the same." "Then that's your answer." Sloane studied her profile. "You were Army." "Yes." "Captain." She turned her head slightly. "Why do you ask?" "The way you stand. The way you said, 'Sir.' The way you walk into a room and assume the emergency will reveal itself before introductions are finished." For the first time that day, the ghost of a smile touched Rowan's face. It was gone quickly. "I was Army." Sloane slid the tablet under one arm. "You do not owe me your history, Dr. Hale. But this floor can be juvenile and people fill silence with nonsense. If there is context that would help your integration here, I recommend giving me something I can work with." Rowan looked at him then. Really looked. He was not trying to humiliate her. He was trying in his own clipped institutional way to determine whether silence was strategy damage or pride. "There is no context I want shared," she said. "I am here to operate. That should be enough." He held her gaze a second longer, then nodded once. "For me, maybe. For them, competence alone rarely cures insecurity." As he walked away, Rowan remained by the window. Below, an ambulance backed into the bay. Men jumped down, opened doors, rolled a stretcher out with practiced speed. For a fraction of a second, the sight split into 2 worlds. Denver and somewhere else. Modern bay and desert dust. Clean uniforms and tan camouflage. Sterile gloves and blood blackened by dirt. The memory came fast and bright enough to sting. She blinked hard until the present returned. At 2:40, she examined a construction worker with a hand injury. An urgent surgical consult calmed a mother whose son needed bowel observation after a bike crash, and caught Brooke entering the wrong medication concentration into an order set. Rowan corrected it before it reached pharmacy. Brooke went red. "I know what I'm doing." "I believe you think that. You don't have to talk to me like I'm incompetent." Rowan assigned the correction. "Then give me less evidence." Paige nearly choked on her own laughter and turned it into a cough. Brooke glared at them both. For the rest of the afternoon, the floor watched Rowan in pieces. Nurses began routing difficult consults her way with the quiet pragmatism of staff who had seen enough to trust without asking permission. Tyler asked her a genuine question about damage control surgery and listened to the answer. Paige grew thoughtful. Nolan grew harder around the eyes. That was the thing about competence in insecure rooms. It did not inspire everyone. Some people admired it. Some people learned from it. Some people felt accused by it without a word being spoken. Near 6, the shift thinned and softened. Day teams handed off to evening. The sky outside the west windows turned the color of old nickel. Rowan finally had 10 uninterrupted minutes in the temporary office the hospital had given her, a narrow room with a metal desk, a phone that rang too loudly, and one framed print of wildflowers that looked chosen by committee. She opened her credential folder to file a signed operative note, and a slim card slipped loose from the inner pocket. It landed face up on the desk. Army Medical Corps. The photograph was older. Her hair then had been regulation dark and pulled back tight, no asymmetry, no scar. Her expression in the photo was younger and more openly difficult, like the camera had interrupted her on purpose. She stared at it for a long moment, then turned it over. There was no reason to keep carrying it. The active duty ID had expired years ago. The edges were worn from being taken out and put back. Yet every time she considered throwing it away, her hand refused. She slid it back into the folder and locked the drawer. When she stepped out of the office, the hall was quieter. Sloane's door was closed. Somewhere far off, a patient laughed at a television show. Somewhere nearer, a nurse cursed softly at a printer jam. Rowan headed for the elevators, but instead of going down, she stopped in front of a darkened window at the end of the corridor. Granite ridges glass reflected the inside better than the city after sunset. She saw herself there in surgical blue. Shoulders set, face pale from fluorescent light. Long hair falling over the left side of her neck. The right side looked normal from a distance. That was the point. If strangers wanted to read style into it, she let them. Style was easier for them than scar. Easier than the truth of skin split open by metal. Easier than a neurosurgeon in Germany saying if the fragment had landed half an inch lower, she would not be speaking. Easier than months of speech drills, hand tests, balance therapy, light sensitivity panic jolts at concussive noise, endless evaluations asking whether she could still think fast enough to cut another human body open and keep them alive. She lifted her hand and tucked the long side back. For one clear second, the scar showed in the reflection. Pale and narrow near the temple, then rougher angling back in a line her hair usually concealed. Her own face changed when she saw it. Not because she had forgotten. Because some days she still did not recognize the woman who came after it. She let the hair fall back into place. An overhead speaker crackled to life with a trauma page from the emergency department, quick and clipped, then went dead. The floor woke instantly. Feet moved, doors opened, voices sharpened. Rowan turned toward the sound before she consciously decided to. Across the corridor, Nolan was already heading for the stairwell with Tyler close behind, and Paige was pulling her hair tighter as she walked. By the time Rowan reached the nurse's station, the details were coming in fast, over the desk phone. Motorcycle collision, male patient, hypotensive, possible internal bleed, 5 minutes out. Brooke looked up from the chart rack. Nolan reached for gloves. Sloane's office door swung open. No one was laughing now. Rowan set her folder down on the counter and held out her hand for the incoming trauma sheet. The night had finally found its first honest language. Rowan took the trauma sheet, scanned 3 lines, and was already moving before the last set of vitals came through. Male, 32. Motorcycle collision on I-25. High-speed ejection. Hypotensive in the field. Distended abdomen. Left leg deformity. ETA 4 minutes. The emergency department sat 2 floors below surgery, loud even on calm nights. On trauma nights, it felt like the inside of a struck bell. Doors flying. Shoes clipping hard. Radios spitting half-sentences. The air carried the raw chemical bite of antiseptic over sweat engine fumes, old coffee, and blood that had not reached the floor yet, but was on its way. Rowan pushed through the double doors into that sound and watched the room sort itself around the incoming chaos. Nurses checked tubing. Respiratory rolled a vent to the wall and locked the wheels. A tech tore open fresh trauma packs and spread them across steel. Nolan Briggs stood at the foot of the bay pulling gloves over restless hands, shoulders set a little too high. Tyler moved to his left. Brooke hovered near the medication cart, ready enough to be useful, nervous enough to make someone else pay for it later. Sloane came in behind them, not speaking, watching the room become itself. The siren cut off outside. Everybody looked toward the ambulance doors. The paramedics burst in with the stretcher between them, tires rattling over the threshold. The patient was strapped hard to the board helmet, gone chest rising in short, ragged bursts. Blood dried along one side of his face. His riding jacket had been cut open. Purple bruising spread low across his abdomen like a storm front. His left leg, bent wrong below the knee, splinted in place but swelling fast. One medic was squeezing blood into him by hand through a pressure bag. 32-year-old male, the paramedic barked as they transferred him over. Single rider. Witness says he clipped the median and got thrown 20 feet. Pressure was 80/50 in the field, then down to 76. Heart rate 140. Abdomen getting firmer by the minute. Diminished breath sounds left side improved after needle decompression. 2 large bore lines, 1 unit running. No response worth mentioning. Nolan stepped in. I'm trauma lead. The paramedic nodded and kept talking. Possible abdominal bleed. Possible pelvis. Left fib looks crushed. Pupils equal. GCS 12 when we loaded him, now 10, maybe 11. The patient groaned, once wet and low. His eyes opened just enough to show fear before rolling shut again. Rowan saw the whole picture in fragments the way she always did. Not one clean diagnosis. A field of clues. The bruising across the lower abdomen. The way the belly rose on one side more than the other. The faint gray tension in the flank. The amount of blood already in him for someone still losing color this fast. The leg was a problem, but it was not the problem. Nolan started the primary survey in a voice a touch louder than necessary. Airway compromised, but present. Prep to intubate. Breath sounds recheck. Get me a fast exam now. A nurse put gel on the ultrasound probe and handed it over. Nolan glanced at the screen as black and white shadows bloomed. He leaned closer. So did Tyler. Free fluid flickered in the abdomen, obvious enough. Nolan nodded to himself. Intra-abdominal bleed. We go upstairs and open. Rowan looked at the patient's side again. The bruising pattern sat wrong. Too deep. Too lateral. Not just belly. Hidden space behind the cavity where blood could pool before anyone appreciated the scale of it. Check the retroperitoneum, she said. Nolan did not turn. We are. No, you're confirming what you already decided. That got his head around. The room tightened. The patient's pressure dipped again. A monitor chirped in faster bursts. Nolan said, I have positive fluid and a crashing trauma. I don't need a lecture. Rowan stepped to the rail, one hand on cold steel eyes on the patient. The flank bruising is spreading. The belly is not tense enough for the number he's losing. The bleed is deeper than what your screen is showing. Tyler looked from Nolan to Rowan, caught between deference and accuracy. Nolan snapped, not everyone with a fellowship from Walter Reed gets to play Oracle in my bay. Sloan said nothing. It was the kind of silence that did more than a rebuke. Rowan did not rise to Nolan's tone. Then stop hearing the fellowship and start hearing the patient. For 1 second, Nolan stood there held between pride and the possibility that she was right. Then pride won. He handed the probe off and pointed to the doors. Move or now. The bay exploded into motion again. Respiratory took the airway. Medications pushed. Tube in. Breath sounds checked. The stretcher rolled. Tyler ran beside the bagged blood. Brooke called upstairs. Nolan walked at the head issuing orders clipped and fast enough to sound certain. Rowan walked with them, not because he asked, but because someone in that room had to be thinking ahead. In the trauma elevator, nobody spoke. The patient's oxygen saturation blinked. The bag valve mask hissed. The fluorescent light overhead painted everyone sallow and unreal. Rowan watched the blood pressure cycle. 72, then 68. Then unreadable for a full second before numbers stuttered back. When the doors opened, the OR team was already waiting. Inside the room, heat from the lamps met the chill still clinging to the patient from outside. Metal clinked. Drapes went up. The anesthesiologist called for more product before the incision had even been made. Nolan took the scalpel with a speed that said he wanted this over before doubt could catch him. The first cut opened dark. Blood welled, suction caught up, packs down, hands in. For 3 long breaths, it looked like Nolan might still be right. Then Rowan saw his shoulders change. Just slightly. The body finding something it had not expected. Where is it? Tyler muttered from across the table. The blood was there, yes, but not enough of it where it should have been. Not enough for a man collapsing this quickly. Not enough to explain the gray wash in his skin. Nolan looked deeper, then left, then deeper again. Rowan said posterior. He ignored her. She stepped closer. Sweep the left side deeper. He's pouring behind it. Nolan's jaw locked. The anesthesiologist called out from the head of the bed. Pressure is gone. I need control now. Sloan had come into the OR and taken position near the wall, hands folded gaze, moving from the field to Nolan's face and back again. Tyler looked up. Nolan. That was enough. Nolan shifted. Deeper. Left. His hand vanished farther into the cavity and came up slick, redder, heavier. There, Rowan said. The next seconds came apart fast. Massive, concealed bleeding. Deep, retroperitoneal source. The kind that could steal a life while everybody looked in the wrong place and still swear they were moving quickly. Nolan froze just long enough for the room to feel it. Rowan stepped in. Not dramatically, no declaration, no challenge. She simply moved 1 pace forward, gloved hands out, and the scrub nurse put instruments in them as if the room had made the decision before Nolan did. More packs, deeper. Suction here, not there. Tyler, retract and hold until your forearm burns. Tyler obeyed at once. Nurse, activate massive transfusion if it is not already active. It is. Good, stay ahead of me. The anesthesiologist called I have blood coming. He's not buying much time. Rowan reached into the wound. Her hand found the bleeding space by feel first, anatomy second. Pressure. Angle. A structure slipping under blood and panic. She clamped, adjusted, clamped again. The field changed. Not fixed, better. Now we have him, she said. Nolan stood opposite her, breathing through his mask, eyes hot with the kind of humiliation that burns because it has witnesses. He tried to re-enter the field. Rowan did not block him. She gave him a job. Pack the lower quadrant, no tighter than that. You are not tucking in a child. Something like anger flashed in his face. Something like obedience answered it. They worked another 90 minutes, blood product after blood product. Pressure crawling back by inches, leg stabilized for later ortho repair. Abdomen temporarily closed, pulse held. When the final dressing was secured, the room emptied in the strange exhausted quiet that follows a rescue people know came close enough to smell. Rowan peeled off her gown. Sweat cooled down her spine. The back of her neck ached where tension always gathered when old instincts rose too fast. Tyler was still looking at her like he had just seen a hidden door in a familiar house. Paige met them outside the OR, having come up from another case when she heard the trauma status. Did he make it? He made it to ICU, Tyler said. Paige looked at Rowan. Not because Tyler's words told her enough, but because his face did. Sloan came out last. He stopped beside Nolan and kept his voice level private enough to preserve a little dignity, audible enough to establish the truth. When an experienced trauma surgeon gives you a warning, you do not hear the tone you dislike and ignore the content. You hear the warning. Nolan's face shut down. Yes, sir. Sloane's eyes flicked to Rowan. Good work. She nodded once. The hallway broke apart into motion again. ICU transfer. Charts. Phone calls. Blood orders. Families. Trauma never really ended. It simply changed rooms. But by the time Rowan got to the locker room, the whole surgical floor knew exactly two things. The new temp doctor had been right. Nolan Briggs had not. That bought her respect from some people. From Nolan, it bought fury. The locker room was narrow and too warm, lined with dented metal lockers painted a blue that had once intended cheer and given up. Rowan was halfway out of her scrub top when the door opened behind her hard enough to slap the stopper. Nolan came in. Not loud, worse. Quiet, in the way men get when they are holding shame by the throat and calling it control. You did that on purpose. Rowan did not turn right away. She hung the scrub top on the hook and reached for a clean shirt. Did what? Made me look incompetent. She faced him then. You did not need help with that tonight. His expression sharpened. There it is. There, what is? That thing you do. You walk into a room acting like everybody around you is slower than you, softer than you, beneath you. Rowan pulled the clean shirt over her head. Interesting theory. Is it raw? Yes. He gave a short, humorless laugh. Really? Because from where I stand, you love this. The silence, the haircut, the military mystique, the way everybody has to wonder what happened to you. It makes you impossible to challenge because apparently you have some tragic backstory and superior instincts the rest of us are supposed to bow to. The locker room seemed to shrink by an inch. Rowan crossed to the bench and set her folded scrubs down with deliberate care. You think my hair is a strategy. I think everything about you is a strategy. She looked at him for a long second, long enough that his certainty wavered without him wanting it to. Then she said very quietly, the patient had a hidden bleed. I saw it. I said it out loud. You ignored it. That is the only story in that room that belongs to you. Nolan stepped closer. You could have said it differently. I said it in time. You said it like you wanted everybody watching. Her jaw tightened. I said it so he would live. Something flashed across Nolan's face then. Not agreement. Recognition of an argument he could not defeat. So he reached for the smaller weapon. Maybe if you spent less time trying to be different, and more time acting like part of the team, people would take you seriously. The words were childish. The damage was not. A tiny pause entered Rowan's breathing. So small another person might have missed it. Nolan did not. He saw he had hit something. He mistook that for being right. He put a hand on his locker door and leaned in. You know what they say about you, right? The betting pool, the guesses, breakdown, attention-seeking. Some failed reinvention. You don't shut any of it down because mystery is the whole point. Rowan's voice went flat enough to freeze water. Get out! He did not move. She took one step toward him. The room changed. For the first time since he entered, Nolan really looked at her. Not as the temp doctor, not as the rival. As a person who had gone still in a way that belonged to older violence than this room deserved. There was no threat in her posture. There was something worse. The total removal of warmth. Get out, she said again. He stared at her another beat, then laughed under his breath, as if he had chosen to end the conversation and not lost control of it. Right? Fine. He pushed off the locker and left, letting the door slam behind him. The sound cracked through the small room like a shot. Rowan did not flinch outwardly. Inside, the floor shifted. She sat down on the wooden bench before her knees made that decision for her. The room was suddenly too bright, too close, air sticking in her chest halfway down. Her fingers went to the right side of her head before she could stop them pressing against the short growth over the scar. The slam had done it. Not the volume. The shape of the sound. Metal and force and enclosed space. The body remembers form even when the mind argues. The locker room blurred around the edges. Canvas walls snapping in hot wind. The smell of dust and diesel and cauterized flesh. A lieutenant on the table. Her gloves already red. Somebody outside shouting coordinates. Then the white core of impact. The ground going sideways. Metal through skin. Light, dust, screaming. Rowan bent forward, elbows on knees, fingertips digging into her scalp as if pressure alone could pin her to the present. She counted what she could see. Locker vents. White tile. Untied shoelace. Nameplate on the opposite door. Hail. No, not the nameplate. The bench. The concrete block wall painted bad blue. The fluorescent flicker above her left shoulder. Colorado. Granite Ridge. Not Syria. Not the tent. Not the rubble. Her breath came back in hard, small pulls. She closed her eyes and saw Caleb Dunn anyway. Face gray under dust. Neck at an angle that had told the truth before she reached him. Dr. Aaron Shaw, half buried by a support beam, one hand visible wedding ring bright through blood. Rowan opened her eyes. The memory did not leave. It only loosened its grip enough for the room to return. She sat there until the sweat on her back went cold. Nobody came in. Beyond the door, the hospital moved on with its indifferent pulse. When she finally stood, she crossed to the sink and ran water over her wrists. One, then the other. Old trick. Cold present over skin, something to hand the body that belonged to now. By the time she left the locker room, her face was calm again. The floor, however, had not calmed. Stories moved faster than labs in every hospital Rowan had ever worked in. By 9 that night, the tale had already been retold 6 different ways. In one version, she had practically diagnosed the bleed by smell. In another, she had embarrassed Nolan in front of Sloan on purpose. In a third, she was ex-military special operations, which was absurd, but somehow more attractive to rumor than the truth. Staff at the nurses' station lowered their voices when she passed. Orderlies looked at her with fresh interest. A med student near radiology asked Tyler too loudly, "Is she the one with the side shave?" Tyler answered with unusual sharpness, "She's the one who saved your trauma patient." That bought a few seconds of quiet. Not enough. Just before midnight, Rowan sat at a terminal outside the ICU finishing notes on the motorcycle crash. The patient's pressure had stabilized after resuscitation. The leg would need a long salvage attempt by ortho in the morning. There was a wife now in a family room on the 2nd floor, holding a paper cup she had not drunk from, waiting for better numbers than the ones medicine could honestly promise. Rowan typed findings into the chart-reviewed products, signed the plan. A shadow fell across the desk. Paige Lawson stood there with 2 coffees in paper cups. "I guessed," Black Paige said. Rowan looked at the coffee, then at Paige. "You guessed right." Paige handed one over and sat in the neighboring chair without asking permission, in the way certain competent people did when they had already decided to offer company, but wanted to make it easy to refuse. For a minute, they said nothing. ICU noises breathed around them, pumps ticking, monitor alarms chirping from behind closed doors, a television in a distant room talking to no one. Somewhere a patient called for a nurse in a hoarse, repetitive voice. Paige finally spoke. "He ignored you because it was you saying it." Rowan took a sip. "The coffee was awful and hot enough to hurt. He ignored me because he had already chosen his diagnosis." Paige tilted the cup in one hand. "Both can be true." Rowan did not answer. Paige watched the hallway. "They are being cruel." "Who? You know who." Rowan looked back to the screen. "They are being young." Paige gave a low, tired breath. "That is a generous word for it." A transport cart squeaked past the station wheels in need of grease. When it was gone, Paige said, "I heard about the betting pool." Rowan's fingers stopped on the keyboard. "There's a what?" Paige winced. "So you had not heard. Number." Paige looked annoyed on Rowan's behalf, which was somehow more unsettling than sympathy. Brooke started it as a joke. Nolan fed it. A few interns added guesses. Bad breakup. Breakdown. Trying to look dangerous. Hidden divorce, some version of that. Rowan stared at the monitor without seeing the words. The screen reflected her face back faintly in ghost text and dim green. Paige went on, anger thinning her usual calm. I should have shut it down harder. You told me this because I would want to know. The first response that rose in Rowan was not hurt. It was embarrassment. Immediate and hot. Not because they had mocked her, because they had turned something she had kept carefully private into entertainment without even knowing what it was. The humiliation of being misread is its own species of injury. It leaves no bruise anyone else can see. She resumed typing. Perfectly even, thank you. Paige let the silence sit. Then softer, you do not have to explain yourself to anyone here. That landed too near the truth. Rowan saved the note and closed the chart. No, I don't. When she finally looked up, Paige had seen enough in her face to regret the conversation without regretting that it had happened. They finished the coffee in silence. At 1:20, a perforated ulcer came in from the ED. At 2:10, a post-op bleed declared itself on the 6th floor. At 3, the city outside the windows disappeared under a drifting spring snow nobody had forecast correctly. Trauma slept. General surgery did not. Rowan operated once more before dawn and did not leave the OR until pale light had begun to press itself into the east-facing windows of the upper hall. Her body moved on training by then, thoughts, precise emotions stored where they could not interfere with hands. The next day should have felt different after the save. It did, and it did not. Nurses greeted her with more confidence. Tyler asked direct questions without trying to prove he already knew the answer. Paige stayed measured, but now there was respect in the space between them that had not been there the first morning. Brooke grew fluttery and overbright whenever Rowan entered a room, a sure sign of a guilty conscience not yet mature enough to become a real apology. Nolan became polite. That was worse. Politeness, when it is only resentment buttoned into a clean shirt, has a glare to it. He stopped making jokes in public. He did not stop resenting her in private. Rowan could feel it every time he yielded a case point half a beat too late, or answered a direct question with that faint clipped tone men used when they thought they were being controlled by a woman and wanted to call it something else. By mid-afternoon, the betting pool had reached the nursing staff, then radiology, then one unit clerk who loved drama enough to pass it into transport. Rumor in a hospital moves along practical lines. Whoever touches the chart touches the story. By the time Rowan crossed the second floor for a consult, she could feel eyes on the shaved side of her head before she even turned a corner. In the elevator that evening, 2 respiratory therapists stopped talking the instant she stepped in. One of them smiled too fast. Long day. Rowan said, "That depends on who you ask." The doors opened. They let her out first. When they thought she was gone, one of them whispered, "That's her." The other answered, "Seriously, that's the haircut." Rowan kept walking. The injury itself had long ago stopped being the worst part. Flesh heals, or it does not. Nerves wake up wrong. Hair grows back uneven. Skin remembers the line metal took through it. Those were facts. Facts could be managed. What she had never adjusted to was the way strangers treated visible difference like a public invitation. Curiosity wrapped as concern. Judgment wrapped as humor. Pity wrapped as praise. Everybody wanting a piece of a story they had done nothing to carry. At 6:30, Sloan called her into his office again. This time he closed the door. On his desk sat a chart stack of cooling coffee, and Rowan's file opened to the same page as before. Evaluations. Fellowship. The gap. I had another complaint. From Nolan. Sloan gave her a look. You know already. I can count. He says your manner with him is undermining team cohesion. Rowan let out one dry breath through her nose that might almost have been laughter. That is a generous translation of being wrong in public. He was wrong. Yes? Sloan leaned back in his chair. You were also not gentle. He did not require gentle. The patient required blood control. Sloan folded his hands. I agree. The office was quiet except for a faint HVAC rattle in the vent above the bookcase. Outside the frosted glass, somebody passed with a rolling cart shadow sliding by. Sloan said, there is a separate issue. The floor culture. The floor culture. He held her gaze. It has reached me that there has been commentary about your appearance. Commentary. Cruelty, if you prefer. Rowan said nothing. Sloan's mouth tightened. That should have been stopped sooner. And now that you know, Now I stop it. He stood, came around the desk, and lowered his voice. But I'm also trying to understand why a surgeon with your record is doing temporary coverage in places like this, instead of running her own service somewhere. Rowan looked at the diplomas on his wall rather than answer. He continued, not pushing harder than the question itself already did. Walter Reed does not produce doctors like you by accident. Your hands tonight were not the hands of someone easing back into practice after a sabbatical. Something in her expression must have shifted because Sloane paused. Combat, he said quietly. Rowan looked at him. That was answer enough. Sloane nodded once, not in triumph but in recognition. I thought so. He waited for more. She gave him none. After a moment, he said, You have my word. I am not interested in mining your past for institutional inspiration. I am interested in whether there is anything you need to do your work here. Rowan thought of the betting pool. The whispers. Nolan's voice in the locker room saying mystery is the whole point. She thought of how quickly pity metastasized once truth entered a room. No, she said, there isn't. Sloane accepted the answer because he had no right not to. Still, when she reached the door, he spoke one more time. If you change your mind, say so before the room invents you again. She left without responding. That night, she went home later than planned to an apartment that still looked temporary, even though the lease had lasted 8 months. Sparse furniture. One lamp on by the couch. A bookshelf with more medical texts than novels. A framed photograph turned face down on the credenza because some evenings she could not bear the sight of it. She kicked off her shoes near the door and stood in the small kitchen drinking water straight from a glass, while the city glowed below her windows in scattered amber lines. Denver looked calm from 10 floors up. Cities always do when they are too far away to hear the pain moving through them. Her phone buzzed on the counter. Unknown local number. She let it ring once, twice, then answered. Dr. Hale. A woman's voice, warm and professional. This is Miriam from the VA Outpatient Physical Therapy Clinic. I'm sorry to call late. I have a patient here who believes he knows you. He is rather insistent. Rowan's grip tightened around the glass. My name is not common. He is mistaken. There was a muffled sound on the other end. A man's voice in the background. Urgent, emotional, too far to make out clearly. Miriam came back on. He says your name used to be on his file. Captain Hale. He saw a staff directory photo online through the hospital system and asked me to call. Something cold moved through Rowan's chest. What is his name? A brief shuffle. Then the answer. Luke Bennett. The glass in Rowan's hand did not break, but for one strange instant she felt as though it had. She set it down carefully. When did he ask you to call? Tonight. He comes in twice a week for gait training. Rowan turned toward the dark window over the sink. In the reflection, the long side of her hair hid half her face. Thank you, she said. If he asks again, do not give out my information. Of course. After she hung up, the apartment became very still. Luke Bennett alive. Luke Bennett in Denver. Luke Bennett looking for her. She had not seen him since the medevac chain swallowed the day whole. Not after the field hospital. Not after Germany. Not after Bethesda. Not after the months where every conversation involved scans and deficits, and whether she could still sequence complex tasks with enough speed to be trusted with a knife. She had imagined him sometimes in vague, safe forms. Walking. Married. Forgetting. Men she had dragged toward tomorrow were not supposed to reappear in grocery stores and hospital lobbies in ordinary American weather. They belonged to the sealed compartment where war stored the people it did not kill. She slept badly and arrived at Granite Ridge the next morning with the hard, brittle focus of someone pretending rest had occurred. The hospital, indifferent to private shock, offered no slack. A ruptured gallbladder before 8. Family conference at 9. Trauma review at 10:30. Noon consult on a farm equipment injury from outside the city. By 2:30, she had almost managed to sink back under the current of work when a nurse from the surgical floor found her outside radiology. Dr. Hale. Rowan turned. The nurse was one of the older staff, competent, unsentimental, the sort who could hang blood calm a panicked husband and shame an intern with one look. Her badge read Denise Carter. There's someone asking for you downstairs. Rowan's pulse changed once. Just once. Enough. Who? He did not say much. Late 30s maybe, in a wheelchair, veteran support hoodie. Denise hesitated, eyes searching Rowan's face. He seemed upset. The fluorescent hall, the rolling stretchers, the voices over intercom. all of it narrowed to a single clear line. Rowan handed Denise the chart in her hand without checking where it landed. Page to cover my consult if it turns into a delay. Denise nodded before the sentence had fully left Rowan's mouth. Rowan was already moving toward the elevators. By the time the elevator doors opened onto the main floor, Rowan had already put her face back in order. Hospitals trained people to do that. Whatever cracked in private had to be sealed before it crossed a public threshold. Fear could wait, exhaustion could wait, grief could wait, the work never did. The lobby of Granite Ridge carried the late afternoon rush in full. Families clustered near the information desk with paper coffee cups and visitor stickers pressed to their jackets. A child in a puffy red coat dragged one sneaker against the tile while his mother tried to keep him still. A transport aide steered an empty wheelchair around a florist delivery bucket. Near the windows, 2 volunteers folded discharge packets and spoke softly over a crossword puzzle. Phones rang. The front doors sighed open and closed in measured bursts, spilling in flashes of cold air from the Denver street outside. Then the room tilted toward one point. A man in a wheelchair near reception had turned in Rowan's direction so quickly his hand slipped off the rim. He wore dark jeans and a gray veteran support sweatshirt, the left leg of the jeans neatly pinned below the knee. His shoulders were broader than she remembered, and his face older in the ordinary ways war-aged people even after they came home. But the eyes were the same, alert even through shock, fierce even through pain. Luke Bennett. He stared at her like his body had forgotten how to breathe. For one suspended second, the lobby still moved around them. The child tugged at his coat. A volunteer laughed at something in the crossword. A phone at reception kept ringing. Then Luke's face broke open. Captain Hale. His voice came out frayed barely above a whisper, but the title alone was enough to freeze Rowan where she stood. The receptionist looked up. A nurse at the elevator bank turned. 2 residents coming down the hall slowed at once. Luke pushed hard on the wheels, trying to get himself forward too fast. The chair jerked, swerved, bumped against the corner of the desk. He did not seem to notice. No, he said, eyes filling before the thought had fully formed. No way. No way. Rowan felt every gaze in the lobby lift and settle. She walked the last few feet toward him before she could decide whether that was wise. Luke. Hearing his own name in her voice seemed to undo the last thread holding him together. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Doctor. The word came out as a sob. He covered his face with one hand and bent forward in the chair, shoulders shaking the sound torn straight out of somewhere too deep to be dignified. Everything in the room changed. People did not know what story they were looking at, but they knew emotion when it arrived with that kind of force. The volunteers stopped folding packets. A security officer near the doors paused mid-step. At the far end of the lobby, Sloan had come out of the administrative corridor at the shift in atmosphere alone and was already angling closer, his expression sharpening as he took in the scene. Rowan crouched in front of Luke without thinking about the tile or the eyes on her. Luke, she said more quietly, look at me. He lowered his hand. His face was wet, unguarded, wrecked by relief. We thought you were dead. The sentence landed louder than he intended. It echoed in the sudden hush. Rowan's pulse hit once hard enough to make the edge of the room sharpen. I'm not dead. No one would tell us anything after they flew you out. His breath hitched. Germany, then stateside, then nothing. We heard there was a skull injury. We heard they retired you. We heard all kinds of things, and none of it was real enough to hold. Luke, she said, glancing around at the ring of attention gathering around them. Not here. But he was already past restraint. Some reunions happen in controlled places with chairs and tissues and time to prepare a sentence. This was not that kind. This was grief colliding with gratitude in a public room after being trapped in the body for too many years. He gripped the arm of the wheelchair so hard the tendons stood out in his hand. I looked for you. His voice shook with the effort of keeping pace with his own memory. I mean it. I tried. Cole tried. Ruiz tried. Everybody did. They wouldn't tell us where you went. Rowan stood because crouching made her feel too exposed, and standing did not help. All it did was raise her into full view of the floor. By then, the residents had arrived at the edge of the scene. Paige first, then Tyler. Brooke, a step behind with both hands clasped too tightly at her waist. Nolan, farther back, slowing as soon as he recognized Rowan in the center of the room, his face already preparing itself for contempt, before confusion interrupted it. Sloan came to a stop beside the information desk. He said nothing. There was no room left in the moment for administrative language. Luke looked around the lobby, as if seeing all of them for the first time. These people know who you are. The question held no accusation yet, only disbelief. Rowan kept her voice level through effort alone. I work here. As what? Trauma surgery. A laugh burst out of him, broken and bright with pain. Of course you do. He wiped at his face and failed to get it dry. Of course, that's where you landed. Luke. That was all she said, but there was enough warning in it that Paige glanced sharply from Rowan to the watching staff and seemed in that instant to sense something larger than she had guessed. Luke looked up at Rowan the way people looked at the living after grieving them. Not with surprise anymore. With the ache of reality returning too fast. I saw your picture on the staff page, he said. Just a tiny thing. Name and title. I almost missed it. Then I saw the hair and I thought, no. It can't be. Then I thought maybe it is because who else would wear it like that? The receptionist's eyes flicked involuntarily to Rowan's head, then away. Luke caught it. He followed the look. Then another, then another. The realization crossed his face slowly and all at once. Not just that people had noticed her hair, that they had made a thing of it. His expression changed. Not softer, harder. You people were joking about her hair. Nobody answered. They did not need to. Silence is often the first confession. Brooke looked down at the floor. Tyler's jaw tightened. Nolan crossed his arms, not defensive yet, but close. Sloane's face emptied in that particular way people's faces do when they understand, too late, that a private failure is about to become public. Luke turned back to Rowan and his voice dropped. That's why, isn't it? She did not reply. He lifted one hand, hovering it vaguely near his own temple, in a gesture that mirrored the wound without naming it. To cover it. Luke. She said his name a second time, but there was no stopping him now. Pain had become momentum. He looked at the people around them and raised his voice enough to cut cleanly across the whole lobby. She took shrapnel to the head, saving my unit. A sound moved through the room. Not speech. Something smaller and more human. A collective intake of breath, the kind people make when a sentence rearranges everything they thought they were seeing. Nolan's arms dropped to his sides. Brooke's hand flew to her mouth. Paige went still in the exact way she did in the OR when something dangerous had just presented itself, and all available attention had to lock on. Rowan felt the back of her neck go cold. Luke, stop. Number. He was crying again, but his gaze was steady now, fixed on the crowd rather than on his own emotion. Whatever shame he might have felt about breaking down in public was gone. The truth had outranked it. You want to know why her hair looks like that, he said. I'll tell you. Sloane took one step forward. Sir, perhaps we should move this conversation somewhere private. Luke swung his eyes toward him with a force that made the older man pause. Private is how people stay ignorant. The lobby had become utterly silent. Even the child in the red coat had gone quiet, staring from behind his mother's leg. Luke drew a breath that scraped on the way in. July 23rd, Northern Syria. Forward surgical station outside Raqqa. We took an IED blast right on the perimeter. It ripped through the aid station while Captain Hale was in the middle of surgery. The room disappeared for Rowan in flashes. Not completely. She still knew where she was. Still saw the desk, the floor, the glass doors. But over it came the memory, sudden and brutal, superimposed with such detail that the air in her lungs seemed to remember sand, canvas straining in desert wind, a lieutenant on the table chest open under harsh light, Caleb Dunn reaching for fresh gauze, Aaron Shaw saying something she never got to finish, then impact. Not sound at first. Force. The body hit before the ears understood. A blow through ground and air and bone. Luke kept speaking, and the present kept pulling against the past, like two hands fighting over the same rope. She should have gone down with the rest of us. She should have bled out in that tent. Part of the roof came in. There was smoke and dust and screaming everywhere. We couldn't see who was alive. Half of us were trapped. She had a head wound, and I mean bad. Blood all over the side of her face. She could barely stand. Luke. Rowan's voice cracked this time. Small, but audible. He looked at her and softened for the first time since he started, but he did not stop. You want me to stop because you always do this. You carry it alone and call that strength. His eyes shone. No, not this time. He turned back to the room. She kept moving. The words fell into the lobby one by one. She pulled Mason Cole off a collapsed beam with one arm because the other one barely worked. She dragged Ruiz clear of burning canvas. She triaged 12 of us while she was bleeding through her own uniform, 12. Tyler's face had gone pale. Paige looked as if she had stopped blinking. Brooke was crying without making a sound. Luke pointed at Rowan with a hand that trembled from remembered helplessness as much as from the injury he had carried into civilian life. She kept saying, "Stay with me. Stay with me, stay with me," to all of us. Like she had enough life for every man in that place. She was packing wounds and barking for plasma and tearing shirts for pressure wraps while blood was running down her neck. The details pulled free inside Rowan against her will. Cole screaming because the support strut had crushed his lower leg. Ruiz gasping pink foam. Her own right eye half blinded by blood. The radio dead. The smell of hot dust diesel and opened bodies. A hand under rubble that she had known at once was Aaron's by the wedding ring. Not enough time, never enough time. Luke's voice broke again. She got me out from under a wall section after the second collapse. Do you hear me? There was a second collapse and she still stayed. The words, second collapse, struck the center of Rowan's chest harder than the rest. She had lived inside that phrase for years. It was where the story always split. The moment after which the body she had been and the body she would become were no longer the same. One of the volunteers whispered, "Oh my God," and covered her mouth. Sloan had not moved. If anything, he seemed to be standing more carefully now, as if any motion at all might become disrespectful. Luke wiped at his face with the heel of his hand and failed again to steady his breathing. They finally got us reinforced and medevac inbound. She stayed conscious until she knew the last of us had a chance. Then the damn roof gave way again, and she went down. We thought that was it. We thought she was gone. No one in the room so much as shifted weight. Luke looked up at Rowan, and his voice dropped into something raw and intimate enough to make the whole room feel suddenly intrusive. "I heard you calling out counts while you were under it. You were pinned and still trying to track who was breathing." That memory returned sharper than the rest because it belonged to the border between consciousness and its failure. A dark weight over her back, dust in her mouth, the taste of blood and insulation, someone shouting numbers. Her own voice refusing to stop working because if she stopped, then everyone else would become final too. Rowan closed her eyes once, only once. When she opened them, the lobby was still there. Everyone still watching. Luke saw the expression on her face and his own changed with it. The fierceness gave way to grief. "You saved my whole unit," he said, and now there was no performance in the sentence at all. My whole unit. He looked at the hospital staff one by one, as if willing them to understand not just the facts, but the scale. Mason got home to his wife because of her. Ruiz got home. Jacob Fields got home. I got home. You people were laughing at the hair she uses to cover the scar that happened because she chose us over herself. The accusation sat in the center of the lobby and did not need embellishment. Rowan could feel the air changing around her in another way now. The crude curiosity that had followed her through hallways all week had evaporated. In its place came something else that was not easier to bear. Shock, yes. Shame, yes. But also the first edge of the thing she had spent years avoiding. Reverence. The minute people believed they had identified a hero, they stopped seeing the human being who had been trying to do a job and started reaching for symbols. She could not allow that, not here, not from them. Not after the way they had decided who she was with so little evidence. Her hand rose before she consciously chose it. She caught the long side of her hair and swept it back. The movement was simple. That was what made it devastating. Until then, most of them had only seen hints. A clipped edge above the ear. The suggestion of asymmetry. Nothing complete enough to carry consequence. Now, the full line of the scar showed under the hard lobby light. It started just inside the right temple, ran back in a pale, uneven path above the ear, and disappeared into the darker hair toward the base of the skull. Not theatrical. Not cinematic. Worse than that. Real. Skin that had torn and been closed and would never again pretend otherwise. Brooke made a strangled sound in the back of her throat. Tyler looked away first then back as if looking away had felt like cowardice. Paige's eyes glistened but held steady on Rowan's face, not the scar. A small act of respect that Rowan noticed and despite herself stored. Nolan looked as if he had been struck. For the first time since she arrived at Granite Ridge, no one saw a hairstyle. They saw damage. They saw survival. They saw the cost of the jokes they had passed around like loose change. Rowan let the hair fall only halfway. Enough to remain uncovered. Enough to refuse the old reflex 1 second longer than it wanted. "I am not ashamed of it," she said. Her voice was quiet. It did not need volume. The room was already leaning toward every syllable. But I was not interested in making it public property. She looked from Luke to Sloane, from Sloane to the residents, from the residents to the wider ring of nurses and staff who had spent 3 days building stories around the visible edge of a wound they had not earned. I did not owe anyone here an explanation. Nobody disagreed. Brooke's shoulders had folded inward in on themselves. Dr. Hale. Astiaye. Rowan turned her eyes on her and Brooke stopped. Not because Rowan glared. Because she did not. The absence of heat was harder to bear. Anger, at least, would have made the moment cleaner. You thought it was a fashion statement, Rowan said. A breakdown, a performance. Something to laugh about in the lounge. Brooke's face flushed blotchy red. We didn't know. No, Rowan said. You didn't? The sentence cut deeper than accusation because it named the real failure. Not ignorance. Certainty without knowledge. Nolan found his voice at last and it came out rough. Dr. Hale, I didn't. Don't. He stopped. It was not a dramatic command. It was exhaustion, sharpened to a point. Rowan drew in a slow breath. The lobby had become too bright. Too open. She could feel the old pressure gathering behind her eyes. Not panic exactly, but the body's warning that the line between control and overload had begun to narrow. Sloane seemed to recognize it. Dr. Hale, he said carefully, my office, meaning privacy, shelter, escape route. Rowan shook her head once. If she left now, the room would turn the story into whispers by the end of the hour. Sanitized versions, noble phrasing, institutional regret. She had spent too many years watching public discomfort rush to cover itself with polished language. No, she said, if this stays here, it stays honestly. Her gaze found the younger staff again. You do not get to laugh at what you have not had the courage to ask about. You do not get to make a game out of a colleague's appearance because you cannot tolerate not knowing something. And you do not get to hear this now and pretend the problem was only that you lacked information. A nurse near the desk dropped her eyes. Brooke wiped at her cheeks. Tyler looked as though he wanted to apologize, and knew that wanting was not enough. Paige stepped forward at last. Not to center herself, to stand where accountability belonged. We were wrong. It was simple. Direct. Rowan respected her more for that than she would have for anything longer. Paige swallowed once and continued. Not because we misread the reason, because we made your body and your appearance a subject for entertainment. There is no version of that would have been acceptable. Sloane's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly with agreement. Luke sat back in the wheelchair, now spent but resolute, one hand still gripping the wheel as if he needed the metal to hold himself in the present. He looked up at Rowan, and his expression softened into something gentler than grief. You carried us out, he said. You remember that. Her mouth tightened. I remember enough. You remember the wrong part. There it was. The thing she had known he might say if he ever found her. The argument she had no defense against because it came from the mouths of the living. I remember Aaron and Caleb, she said. The names slipped into the lobby and made the room even smaller. Most people there did not know who those names belonged to, but they felt the shape of loss in them immediately. Luke nodded, tears rising again. I know. He put a hand to his chest like he could steady the ache physically. I know you do. But we remember the rest. Rowan looked at him. He went on more quietly. Cole has twins now. Ruiz teaches high school. Fields is coaching baseball and still limps when it rains. I'm here, we are all here, because you stayed. The words did not comfort. Not right away. That was the trouble with truths she had resisted for years. They entered like splinters before they became anything else. Behind Luke, the front doors slid open and closed around a gust of cold air that nobody seemed to feel. Daylight had thinned outside to a gray late afternoon, the city blurred by a low drift of snow beginning over the avenue. Somewhere above them, an intercom called for respiratory therapy on 4. The ordinary life of the building resumed at the edges, careful and stunned, as if not fully sure whether it had permission. Brooke finally spoke again, voice shaking. I'm sorry. The phrase sounded too small the moment it entered the air. She knew it. Everyone knew it. Nolan tried next, and his was even worse because shame had made his diction formal. I was out of line. You were lazy, Rowan said. His face tightened. You decided what I was because it made you comfortable, she continued. You did not ask. You did not think. You chose the easiest story and then treated it like truth. He absorbed that without reply. Sloane looked around the lobby at his staff and his residents, and the exposed structure of a culture he had let run unchecked because no one had made enough noise before. "This ends now," he said. The authority in his voice finally moved the room. Not much. Just enough. A clerk straightened. The security officer turned away to give privacy without leaving. The volunteers lowered their eyes. But Rowan was not finished. She looked at Sloane directly. "It should have ended before you knew what caused the haircut." He took the blow and accepted it. "Yes," he said. No defense, no explanation, just yes. For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of what had happened hung there, not resolved, not clean, simply present. Then Luke reached into the pocket of his sweatshirt with clumsy urgency. "I almost forgot." He pulled out his phone, fumbled it awake, and held it up toward Rowan. The screen showed a group photo. 12 men arranged in 2 uneven rows in some community hall or rented VFW room, several in civilian jackets, 2 in service uniforms, 1 on crutches, 1 with an arm around another's shoulder. A hand-lettered banner hung behind them. The letters were rough, probably painted too quickly, but perfectly legible. "Thank you, Captain Hale." Underneath were names. Her throat closed. Luke's voice softened into something almost boyish, despite the tears drying on his face. "They made me promise if I found you, I would show you this first." Rowan stared at the faces. Older. Broader. Some fuller in the jaw, some thinner around the eyes. But recognizable. Every one of them tied to a memory filed under triage tags. Blood types. Chest sounds, pressure dressing, screams, morphine doses, radio calls, and one impossible desert afternoon that had torn itself into all the years after. Her eyes stopped on one face. Mason Cole. Alive enough to smile. Then Jacob Fields. Then Luis Ruiz. Alive, alive, alive. The phone trembled in Luke's hand. "They wanted to thank you properly," he said. "All of us did. We still do." A hot ache surged so suddenly through Rowan that for a second she thought she might actually lose balance. Not from weakness, from emotional whiplash. Years spent measuring that day in the names of the dead, and here in front of strangers stood the living proof of the names she had refused to count for herself. She took the phone. Her fingers were not as steady as she would have liked. No one in the lobby moved while she looked. When she handed it back, her voice was low and scraped raw. "You did not need to do that." "Yes," Luke said, "we did." Their eyes held. There were 100 things she might have said then. Some honest, some defensive, some impossible to put into language in a lobby full of witnesses. In the end, the only one that came was the simplest. "I'm glad you made it home." Luke's mouth trembled into a smile that almost held. "So am I, Doc." The old title, spoken like that, broke something loose behind her ribs she had not realized was still locked. Sloane stepped closer, but this time not as chief of surgery. As a man careful with another person's threshold. "Mr. Bennett," he said softer now, "would you be willing to wait in my office for a few minutes while we clear some space?" Luke nodded immediately. "If she comes too." Every eye in the lobby returned to Rowan. She considered refusing, not because she did not want to talk to Luke, because she no longer trusted the room to let this remain human. Public revelation had a way of flattening people into objects. She could already feel the first dangerous shift in how the staff were looking at her. Not mockery now, something more reverent and less accurate. Then Denise Carter, the older nurse from upstairs, appeared near the elevators with 2 charts hugged to her chest and took in the scene at a glance. Her eyes moved to Rowan. She did not ask a question. She did not offer pity. She only said, "I've got your afternoon consults covered." That quiet competence saved Rowan more than anyone in the room realized. She nodded once. "Thank you." To Luke she said, "All right." As Sloane guided them toward the administrative corridor, the crowd finally parted. No one spoke. Not as Rowan passed. Not as Luke wheeled beside her. Not as the residents stepped back to let them through. She felt every ounce of that silence on her skin. Halfway down the corridor, Luke looked up at her again, his face still stripped of pretense. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what?" "For doing it like this." Rowan kept walking. There was no clean answer. He had exposed what she had protected. He had also returned to her something she had buried with the scar. Neither truth canceled the other. After a moment, she said, "You did what soldiers do. You made noise when quiet wasn't working." A laugh escaped him, then brief and disbelieving through the leftover tears. "That sounds like you." "It used to." He glanced at the visible side of her head and then away, careful now. "It still does." Inside Sloane's office, the blinds were half drawn against the gray light. The room smelled faintly of paper coffee and furniture polish. Sloane closed the door behind them, and for the first time since the lobby, the world shrank back to human scale. Luke spoke for nearly an hour, not all at once. Not in one polished telling, in pieces, starts and stops, memory layering over memory. He filled in what Rowan could not bear to revisit in full and what her injury had blurred beyond sequence. How Cole had screamed for her even when he could not see. How Ruiz had swatted at dust and blood and kept asking whether his younger brother would be notified if he died. How Rowan had made them repeat names and birthdays to stay conscious. How she had shoved her own field dressing into Luke's hand and told him to hold pressure on somebody else because she was busy not losing anyone. How after the second collapse they had heard her still giving orders from under debris until the rescue team dug her out. At one point, Luke laughed through tears, recalling something absurd. "You threatened to write us all up if we bled on your supplies." Rowan stared at him for a second, then a sound came out of her that she had not heard from herself in too long. A real laugh, short, disbelieving, hurt around the edges, but real. "I said that. You absolutely said that." Sloane listened without interruption. Not once did he do the easy thing and call her courageous or extraordinary while she sat there. Rowan noticed that. She appreciated it more than she would have appreciated praise. When Luke finally left, promising through fresh emotion that the others would want to see her if she allowed it, the evening had fallen fully. Snow pressed soft and white against the corners of the window glass. The hospital beyond the office door had resumed its ordinary rhythm, but the rhythm had changed in one specific way. Every step that passed seemed to hesitate at Sloane's door before moving on. Rowan remained standing after Luke wheeled away. Sloane did not speak immediately. He gave the silence enough room to become voluntary rather than strained. At last, he said, "You should have had a better first week here." Rowan looked at the snow outside. That is one way to put it. He exhaled once through his nose. No one on my floor should have needed a combat history to be treated with basic professionalism. There it was again. No evasion. She leaned one hand on the back of the visitor chair and let the steadiness of the wood travel up her arm. No. He turned slightly, watching her with careful attention. "Do you want the rest of the week off?" The suggestion was not insulting. That made it harder to answer. Number. Tomorrow. Number. Then at least go home tonight. That she could not argue with. When she stepped back into the corridor, the staff nearest the administrative wing pretended very badly not to be looking. Brooke stood 20 feet away by the copier with red eyes and a stack of papers she had clearly been carrying for too long. Tyler was beside the chart rack pretending to read something upside down. Paige leaned against the far wall, arms folded, waiting without intruding. Nolan stood farther back than the others, all the easy arrogance burned off his posture. No one approached. Rowan was grateful for that much. She crossed the hall and took the elevator down alone. In the reflective steel of the doors, the long side of her hair still sat partly back from where she had revealed the scar. She made no move to hide it again until the car reached the lobby. By then, the crowd had thinned. The child in the red coat was gone. The volunteers had changed shifts. Reception had returned to phones, clipboards, and routine. Only a few people looked up as Rowan crossed the polished floor toward the exit. Their expressions held nothing like the mockery of 2 days earlier. That should have felt like relief. It did not. Outside, the evening was sharp with snow and traffic. Headlights smeared white and gold across the wet street. Rowan stood under the awning for a moment before walking to her car, the cold needling through her scrubs, and felt an old terrible truth settling in with the weather. Once people knew, they did not simply see better. They saw differently. At home, she left the lights off for a long time and stood by the living room window watching snow gather on the fire escape across the alley. Her phone lay on the kitchen counter in silence for nearly 10 whole minutes. Then it buzzed. Unknown number. Then another. Then a text. "Luke gave me your contact. This is Mason Cole. I've wanted to say thank you for 3 years. Another. Luis Ruiz here. I still have the scar from the tourniquet you put on too tight. Best pain of my life. Another. Jacob Fields. My wife says she prays for you every Sunday whether I mention it or not." Rowan stared at the screen until the words blurred. Then another message arrived, and this one undid her more quietly than all the rest. "My daughter is named Erin." She sat down at the kitchen table because standing was no longer reliable, and outside the snow kept falling over Denver in a silence so complete it felt almost respectful. The snow kept falling long after the city should have gone quiet, and the messages kept coming with it. Rowan sat at the kitchen table in the blue light of her phone, reading each one as if it belonged to someone else's life, until the names forced her to accept they did not. Mason Cole wrote first, then Luis Ruiz, then Jacob Fields, then Aaron Pike, then men she remembered by blood type and wound pattern before memory slowly returned their faces to them. Some wrote too much because they had carried silence too long. Some wrote almost nothing at all. Still here because of you. I never forgot your voice. My son starts kindergarten next month. I kept meaning to find you. Every message pressed on the same locked place inside her and asked to be let in. She did not answer immediately. She could not. Her hands were steady enough in an operating room over a torn artery, over an open abdomen full of blood and panic. A screen full of gratitude was somehow harder. It asked for a version of the story she had never let herself tell. Not the version measured by body counts and blast damage and the names of the dead, but the version in which people had actually lived. She set the phone down and rose from the table too quickly. The chair scraped the floor. She crossed to the sink and braced both hands against the counter. The apartment was quiet, except for the radiator ticking in the corner and the soft brush of tires on wet pavement far below. Snow blurred the outlines of the neighboring buildings until Denver looked unfinished, all hard edges softened by weather and distance. In the dark window above the sink, her own reflection hovered faint and uncertain. One side of her face shadowed beneath the line of her hair, the other still open from what she had let the hospital see. She should have covered it before leaving Sloane's office. She had not. In the car, she had seen it in the rearview mirror and left it alone. The phone buzzed again. She did not turn at first. Then she did. New message. Captain Hale. This is Tommy Velas. I was the one with the collapsed lung. My wife says if I ever met you again, I was supposed to tell you she got 20 more birthdays with me than she thought she would. Rowan covered her mouth with one hand. For 2 years, she had built her life around subtraction. The dead. The career that ended in another country. The surgeries she was not sure she would ever be trusted to perform again. The hand tremor that came and went in early rehab and terrified her more than pain ever had. The memory gaps. The speech drills. The clearance panels with their neat questions and clinical concern. The long, ugly season in which she could not stand bright light or loud sound without feeling the world tilt. She had counted all of that with brutal discipline. She had never once sat in a room and counted the men who came home. At 1 a.m, she finally answered. Not all of them. Just one. Mason. I remember you. I am glad you are here. She stared at the sentence after sending it. Too small. Too formal. True anyway. Within seconds, the 3 dots appeared. I am glad you are too. She laughed once through a sudden burn behind her eyes and sat back down. The messages slowed after 2, not because the gratitude ended, but because normal people slept, and soldiers of a certain age had jobs, children alarms, and early commutes. Rowan left the phone face down on the table and tried to lie down on the couch without undressing. That lasted 12 minutes. Every time she shut her eyes, the lobby came back in pieces. Luke's face when he recognized her. Brooke's hand covering her mouth. Nolan losing every layer of swagger in a single breath. Sloane saying yes when she told him the cruelty should have been stopped, even before anyone knew what caused the scar. She rolled onto her side and looked at the dark line of the bookshelf until gray morning seeped into the edges of the room. By 6:15, she was dressed and driving through a city scrubbed pale by overnight snow. Plows had piled slush at the corners. The mountains were hidden. Traffic moved carefully. Her coffee cooled untouched in the cup holder as she drove. Granite Ridge rose white from the street like it had nothing to apologize for. Inside the lobby looked the same as it always did. Volunteers in bright vests. The information desk lit from below. The smell of coffee and sanitizer. The weather report murmuring from a television bolted in one corner. Ordinariness can be the strangest thing after a public rupture. The building had resumed itself, but not entirely. People looked up when Rowan entered, not with open staring now, worse than that, with caution, with the brittle courtesy that follows shame when no one knows yet what shape repentance should take. She took the elevator to surgery and stepped out into a silence so noticeable it almost felt arranged. The residence lounge door was open. Inside, every chair was occupied except one. Paige stood when she saw Rowan and did not attempt to smile. Tyler rose too. Brooke followed, eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. Nolan stayed seated for half a second longer than the others, then got up as if his own body had ordered him to. Sloane stood near the whiteboard with a folder in one hand. No one spoke until Rowan crossed the threshold. Then, Paige said, "Before anything else, we owe you an apology." Rowan kept one hand on the doorframe. "You do." Paige accepted the bluntness with a small nod. What happened was cruel. Not because we did not know the reason, because we treated your appearance like public property and your silence like an invitation. That was wrong, Tyler added. I should have said more sooner. Brooke looked as if the words were scraping her throat on the way out. I started some of it. Not all, but enough. I made jokes. I treated you like a character instead of a person. I'm ashamed of that. Rowan looked at Nolan. He did not flinch from it this time. I was threatened by you, he said. No polish, no excuse, your skill, the way everyone reacted to it. I used your hair and your distance and anything else I could grab to make you smaller. Then I did it again in the locker room because I was embarrassed and wanted it to be your fault. I was wrong. The room stayed quiet after that, each person left inside his or her own discomfort. Rowan set her bag down on the table, but did not sit. I am not interested in a scene where you all feel terrible for 10 minutes and then call it growth. Brooke's eyes dropped. Paige said neither are we. Sloane stepped forward, then not to rescue them but to widen the frame beyond individual guilt. You should know we had a meeting with administration before 6. Effective immediately, we are revising conduct reporting for the department. Appearance-based harassment targeted gossip retaliation for reporting all of it. I allowed a culture that tolerated too much as long as patient outcomes stayed clean. That ends now. Rowan studied him. Because this happened to a veteran. No, Sloane said. Because it happened to a surgeon on my floor and I should not need a biography to recognize a hostile environment. That answer landed where it needed to. He held out the folder. There is more. Staff support recommendations. Transition accommodations for veteran clinicians. Mentorship structure. Trauma-informed onboarding for new hires coming out of military medicine or extended medical leave. It is a draft, not a polished policy, but it is a start. Rowan took the folder without opening it. Brooke spoke from the end of the table, voice low. Paige and Tyler helped, Denise too. Tyler nodded. We did not want yesterday to become a story people told and then forgot. Nolan said nothing, but the way he stood there, shoulders stripped of performance, suggested he had been in that room too. Rowan opened the folder. The draft inside was rough and practical. Reporting lines, peer mentorship, protected channels for concerns, required professionalism training that actually named body-based ridicule and trauma stigma instead of hiding behind soft language. Not enough. Real, anyway. She closed it. This should exist whether I stay here or not. Sloane's eyes lifted. That is a statement with weight behind it. It was the first time anyone had said out loud what had been hanging in the room since the lobby. Rowan had options. She could finish the temporary contract and vanish into the next assignment the way she had trained herself to do. New city. New badge. New floor. Same controlled distance. Same refusal to belong. For a moment, no one moved. Then, the overhead speaker crackled with a surgical consult on 5, and the room broke. Not emotionally, practically. Medicine has always had the brutal mercy of requiring motion, even while people are still bleeding from something else. The day started. Rowan operated before 9. A gallbladder that had turned septic and angry overnight. Nothing dramatic, nothing symbolic. A body in trouble afield to enter a problem to solve. The old comfort of that almost steadied her. Inside the OR, no one mentioned the lobby, the scar, the army, or the draft policy in Sloane's folder. Instruments arrived when requested. Hands moved where they should. Blood pressure held. Tissue yielded. The world narrowed to truth and sequence. Afterward, outside recovery, Paige fell into step beside her. You did not have to come in today. Yes, I did. Paige glanced at her. Because of pride or because this is easier than sitting with all of it? Rowan almost smiled. You asked direct questions for someone who used to be polite. I was always direct. I was just wrong about where to aim it. They walked a few more paces in silence. Then, Paige said, For what it is worth, seeing that scar did not make me respect you. Watching you keep the lobby from turning into a tribute service while standing inside that much exposure did. That stopped Rowan more effectively than praise would have. Paige kept going, giving her the dignity of not requiring a response. Near noon, Sloan asked Rowan into his office again. This time, there was no careful circling. He closed the door, set a legal pad on the desk, and said, "You are overqualified for temporary coverage." Rowan remained standing. That may be the nicest way anyone has ever called me avoidant. His mouth shifted almost into a smile and thought better of it. Then, let me be plainer. The trauma program here is good, but it is not what it could be. Yesterday proved two things. First, our residents need stronger leadership. Second, you already lead the room, whether your badge reflects it or not. She folded her arms. I'm not sure yesterday is the ideal basis for a job offer. It is not. He met her gaze. Your work is. He slid a paper across the desk. Not a contract. A one-page summary. Director of Trauma Services. Permanent appointment. Expanded authority over training trauma protocols, staffing recommendations, and systems coordination. For a second, she simply looked at the title. Not because she wanted it less than he thought. Because some part of her had wanted it too much once and taught itself to stop. You do not know enough about me to make this offer. I know enough, Sloan said. I know how you assess a room. I know how you operate under pressure. I know my own staff improves when you are in the building. I know that nurses trust you. I know that patients settle around you. I know that yesterday, in addition to everything else, you corrected my department without grandstanding once. She looked down at the paper again. Director. A title can mean many things. Power, exposure, permanence, responsibility. A future anchored to a place where people know your face and start expecting your return. I have spent 2 years doing short contracts for a reason, she said. Sloan leaned back slightly. Because staying would require being known. There it was. Rowan let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Temporary work has advantages. It keeps everybody at a distance. Yes. And how is that strategy treating you? He did not ask it cruelly. That made it harder to dismiss. She thought of the empty apartment. The turned-over photo frame. The way she packed fast whenever a contract ended, leaving before anyone asked too many questions or offered too much kindness. Distance had protected her from pity. It had also hollowed every city into a waiting room. I do not know, she said. That is the first useful uncertainty you have given me all week. She gave him a tired look. You are enjoying this more than you should. Not enjoying. He tapped the paper once, recognizing. She took the offer sheet with her when she left. By mid-afternoon, the floor had stopped pretending nothing had happened and settled into a new careful pattern around her. People did not stare at the visible edge of the scar now, but they also did not perform false normalcy. Denise handed her a chart and said, "Coffee in the conference room if you have eaten nothing since dawn." Tyler asked a question about damage control sequence and listened all the way through the answer. Brooke kept her distance unless spoken to, and in that distance managed to become more respectful than she had ever been while trying to be friendly. Nolan worked hard and quietly and did not once mistake silence for permission. At 4:30, her phone buzzed. Luke, downstairs in Conference B if you can get away. Brought company. Rowan stared at the text for a moment before replying. 5 minutes. Conference B sat off the old education corridor 1 floor below administration, and just far enough from the main traffic of the hospital to feel private without becoming secret. The room had beige walls, a long laminate table, and a coffee machine that always burned the last inch in the pot. Someone had turned on only the side lamps, leaving the overhead lights dim. Luke was there when she opened the door. He was not alone. 3 men rose almost at once. One tall and broad, shouldered with a cane, and a face she recognized before she knew from where. Mason Cole. Older, now beard at the jawline, one knee still stiff when he straightened. Beside him stood Luis Ruiz, leaner than she remembered, with the schoolteacher's tired patience in his eyes and a scar running above his collar. The third man was Jacob Fields, compact, weathered, wearing a baseball cap in his hands, as if he had forgotten where to put them. For a second, all 4 of them simply looked at her. Then Cole laughed, once choked on it, and pressed a hand over his eyes. "You look exactly the same," he said. "That is a lie," Rowan answered automatically. Ruiz smiled through red eyes. "It is, but let him have the moment." Fields crossed the room first and stopped just short of her, waiting for the cue instead of assuming it. When Rowan gave the smallest nod, he pulled her into a careful embrace, the kind given to people who have already carried enough impact. Ruiz followed. Then Cole, who held on an extra second and said into her shoulder, I did not get to thank you then. The sentence moved through her like a crack opening in old ice. They sat. For a while, nobody tried to make it beautiful. They talked the way people do when history is too large for polished speech. In fragments, interruptions, corrections, laughter in the wrong places, silence in the right ones. Cole walked with a cane now, but taught auto shop at a community college outside Colorado Springs. Ruiz taught 11th grade history and had discovered teenagers could be more terrifying than artillery under the right conditions. Fields coached Little League and owned a small roofing business which made everyone in the room stare at him until he admitted he did not actually like heights, but liked feeding his family more. Luke rolled his eyes. He says that like it is normal. It is normal where I live. They showed her photographs on phones. Wives, kids, fishing trips, backyard grills, a dog in sunglasses, Cole's twins in matching soccer uniforms, Ruiz standing in a classroom holding a coffee mug that read, "World's Okayest Teacher," Fields and his daughter covered in blue frosting at a birthday party. The images came one after another, each one a direct contradiction of the story Rowan had told herself in private. Not that the losses were less, never that, but that the day had ended only in ruin. At some point, Luke reached beneath the table and brought up a flat-wrapped package. We argued about mailing this, he said. Then we decided no. Rowan looked at the paper. You should not have. Probably Ruiz said. But you know how soldiers are with instructions. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a plaque of dark wood and brushed brass. Nothing ornate. Military people never trusted ornate. The engraving was clean and direct. Captain Rowan Hale M.D. for refusing to leave us behind. Northern Syria. With enduring gratitude from the men who came home. Her thumb moved over the letters without permission. The room went quiet. Fields spoke first voice low. There are 12 of us alive because you stayed on your feet when every sane person would have run. Rowan looked down at the plaque. Aaron Shaw and Caleb Dunn did not come home. No one moved for a moment. Then Ruiz said gently, we know. Cole leaned forward, forearms on his knees. You think we do not carry them too. Luke's voice softened. Nobody in this room is asking you to trade one grief for another. Fields nodded. We are asking you not to erase us to stay loyal to them. The sentence reached somewhere her own thoughts had never let language touch. Not erase us. The thing about survivor guilt is that it dresses itself as honor. It pretends counting only the dead is a form of respect. It does not tell you that if you are not careful, it turns the living into collateral memory. Rowan set the plaque on the table because her hands had started to shake. For a long time, she sat eyes fixed on the brass. I thought if I let myself feel relief about any of you, it would mean I had accepted losing them. Luke answered first, no. Ruiz shook his head. It means the day was not only what it took. Cole added, it means you did your job in hell and some of us made it out. No one in the room said hero. None of them had to. Their faces carried gratitude without forcing symbolism on her. That made it possible to stay seated. When the meeting ended, evening had deepened against the corridor windows. Luke and the others did not push for promises. No reunion plans, no speeches, no pressure. Only numbers exchanged. Shoulders squeezed one more look held longer than strangers hold it because they were not strangers and had not been for years, even in absence. Fields paused at the door. You staying here? Rowan looked at the plaque in her hands. Then at the hospital beyond the glass. I might. He nodded as if that were enough for now. Good. She took the stairs to Sloane's office instead of the elevator. By the time she reached his door, her breathing had steadied, and the decision inside her had become recognizable even before it was comfortable. Sloane looked up when she entered. His jacket was off. His tie loosened. A stack of charts waited at his elbow. He saw the plaque first, then her face. Well, Rowan set the plaque on his desk beside the offer summary. I will take the job. He did not smile immediately. The moment was too serious for that. He only nodded once with the gravity of someone accepting both a commitment and the history that came attached to it. Good, he said. We begin properly tomorrow. Rowan looked toward the window. Snowlight and city glow blurred together over Denver, turning the glass into a pale mirror. In it, she could see her own reflection beside the office lamps, the scar still visible, the line of her shoulders no longer turned toward escape. When she left the office, she did not pull her hair across it. At dawn, Granite Ridge looked different, only because she did. The building was the same clean stack of glass and steel catching first light over Denver. The lobby still smelled of roasted coffee and disinfectant. The elevators still sighed open with the same indifferent timing. Nurses still moved like people carrying 3 unfinished tasks in their heads before sunrise. The place had not transformed overnight into something softer or wiser, but Rowan walked through it without the old instinct to disappear. She wore dark scrubs under a winter coat and carried the same leather folder she had brought in on her first morning, though now it felt less like a shield and more like a simple object in her hand. The long side of her hair still fell along the left side of her face. The right side remained clipped close. The scar was visible, not displayed, not hidden, visible. A volunteer at the front desk looked up and smiled with careful warmth. Not pity, not reverence, just recognition. "Morning, Dr. Hale." "Morning." That alone told Rowan more about the building than any policy memo could. Respect sounded different when it had stopped trying to correct itself. By 7, Sloan had already sent the department-wide notice. Director of Trauma Services. Effective immediately. Expanded authority over trauma response, resident training, quality review, and emergency systems integration. Rowan had read the email once at her desk, then closed it before it could become something abstract and administrative. Titles only mattered if they changed the room. She intended to change the room. The first meeting happened in the trauma conference space at 7:30. Paige, Tyler Brooke Nolan, half the nursing lead's charge staff from the emergency department, respiratory, radiology liaison, blood bank representative, and Sloan near the wall with a legal pad he had not yet written on. No one chatted before it started. Rowan stood at the front with a marker in one hand and the whiteboard behind her already divided into columns. Response time, assessment failure points, communication errors, massive transfusion delay windows. She looked around the room and saw what she expected. Fatigue, curiosity, anxiety, resistance in at least 3 faces, eagerness in 2, the hard concentration of nurses who did not care what your title was, as long as your system worked in the middle of the night. Yesterday, she said a motorcycle crash nearly died because the room followed the first obvious bleed and missed the deeper one. No one shifted. She turned to the board and wrote with quick, hard strokes. Obvious injuries are liars. They pull attention. Attention gets people killed if you let it narrow too early. The marker squeaked once. She capped it and faced them again. In civilian trauma, you usually have support layers. Imaging, specialty backup, blood access with fewer delays. In combat zones, those layers thin out or vanish. You learn to read what the body is hiding before the machine confirms it. Granite Ridge is not a battlefield. Good. I am not interested in romance. I am interested in speed pattern recognition and fewer funerals. That got them. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was clean. She spent the next hour pulling apart the motorcycle case frame by frame. Not to humiliate Nolan. She never used his name. She dissected the sequence instead. What the bruising pattern suggested. How hidden blood loss distorts the visible picture. How tunnel vision begins. How hierarchy can fail when confidence outruns observation. How everyone in the room bears responsibility for saying the uncomfortable thing before a patient's pressure makes the argument for them. Questions started slowly. Tyler first. How do you train yourself to catch the deeper pattern without overcalling every trauma in front of you? By learning anatomy with consequences attached to it, Rowan said. You stop memorizing where things are and start memorizing how they fail. A nurse from the emergency department asked about blood bank escalation under uncertain source control. Rowan answered without notes. Paige asked about timing thresholds for moving to the OR when imaging and instability were competing. Better question. Sharper. Rowan answered that too. Brooke did not speak for most of the session, but she took pages of notes with the kind of concentrated shame that can become discipline if a person survives the first stage of it. Nolan sat very still. At the end, Rowan placed both hands on the conference table and let the room settle. One more thing, she said. The air changed immediately. They knew this was no longer just about trauma sequence. The culture on this floor is part of patient care. If people are ridiculed for how they look, what they carry, what they have survived, or how they move through the world, they stop speaking early. When people stop speaking early, medicine becomes slower and dumber. No one in that room could pretend not to understand what she meant. You do not have to like every person you work with, Rowan continued. You do have to act like professionals in a building where seconds matter. If you want to speculate about a colleague, do it somewhere else for the rest of your career, Because it is done here. Sloane spoke from the wall, then not to soften the statement but to anchor it with force. It is done here. The meeting broke after that into practical work. New trauma intake checklists, revised escalation language, briefings, resident rotations. Paige stayed back to ask about integrating hemorrhage pattern drills into weekly review. Tyler offered to build a quick pocket reference for interns if Rowan approved the format. Brooke volunteered for the professionalism training rollout with a face that said she understood penance is least meaningful when it is invisible. Nolan waited until the room had nearly emptied. Then he came forward. He did not waste time searching for the best phrasing. That in itself was new. I know I said I was sorry. Rowan looked at him. You did. It was not enough. Number. He absorbed that without protest. He stood with both hands in the pockets of his scrub pants, shoulders squared more honestly than she had ever seen them. Without posture, some people looked smaller. Nolan did not. He looked younger. I want to stay in trauma, he said. If you're going to run this department, I want to learn under you. Not because of what happened in the lobby, because of what happened in the OR. I missed what you saw, and I let ego make me dangerous. Rowan held his gaze. That is true. I know. You will hate parts of training with me. I probably deserve that. This is not punishment. He nodded once, understood. She studied him another second, not deciding whether he felt bad, but whether he could be remade by the feeling. Shame ruins some people. It teaches others where the weak spots are if they are willing to look closely enough. You stay, she said. You work, you listen the first time. You do not make me repeat warnings because your pride needs a hearing test. Something like relief crossed his face and vanished quickly. Yes, ma'am. Her eyes narrowed slightly. He caught it at once. Doctor, sorry. Work on that too. For the first time since she met him, a real smile almost appeared and then retreated. He left with his notebook under his arm and a different kind of silence around him than before. The weeks that followed acquired a rhythm fast enough to keep sentiment from becoming the center of anything. Rowan preferred it that way. She did not want to be the department's story. She wanted to be its standard. Trauma nights sharpened under her. Protocol cards appeared clipped to crash carts and inside chart stations. The emergency bay started sounding different. Shorter handoffs. Fewer repeated questions. Earlier blood calls. Nurses trusted to interrupt if a room locked onto the wrong injury too long. Interns drilled until they could identify hidden bleed patterns in imaging, physical presentation, and mechanism without panicking into guesswork. Rowan taught with dry precision and zero patience for laziness. She did not humiliate people. She simply removed every excuse for staying careless. If you are guessing, say you are guessing, she told a new resident during one review. Uncertainty, stated out loud, is a tool. False certainty is a weapon. Word spread quickly through the hospital that trauma under Hale was harder and cleaner. Residents complained in private about the pace, then requested extra time in the department anyway. Nurses from other floors angled for cross-training slots. ICU staff began sending fewer irritated calls back upstairs because the admissions coming from trauma were better stabilized and better communicated. 3 months in the quality office circulated numbers. Response times down. Massive transfusion initiation faster. Complication rates lower. Survival outcomes improved enough that even administrators started using words like exceptional in emails Rowan deleted after reading. The plaque from Luke and the others sat in the drawer of her office desk rather than on the wall. Not because she was ashamed of it. Because she did not want the room entering myth whenever they sat down across from her. She kept it there, where she could touch the edge of the wood on difficult days, and remember that a scar and a title were not the whole of her. The office itself changed slowly. The cheap landscape print came down. In its place, Rowan hung a framed black and white photograph of a helicopter medevac pad, taken at dusk, rotors blurred, dust rising around figures who could have been anywhere in the last 20 years of American war. She placed one potted plant near the window because Denise claimed every office needed evidence its occupant intended to stay alive. She brought in 2 textbooks so worn at the corners they looked inherited. She turned the old photo of her field team face up and put it on the bookshelf. Erin Shaw smiling with her head bent toward the camera like she had only agreed to the photo under protest. Caleb Dunn, grinning hard enough to look invincible. Rowan between them in desert camis, younger and sunburned, and not yet split in 2 by before and after. On some evenings, she still looked at the photo and had to sit very still. Healing had not arrived because respect did. Trauma does not care whether a room finally knows your story. There were still sounds that tightened the muscles at the base of her skull before thought caught up. Still mornings she woke with the old pressure behind her right eye and had to breathe through the memory of blast light. Still nights when snow against a window became dust against canvas, if she let fatigue strip away the edges between then and now. But the difference was this: she no longer treated the symptoms like proof she did not belong. That change surfaced clearly one afternoon when a first-year resident knocked on her open office door. Young woman. Army Reserve patch on an old duffel slung over one shoulder. Name, badge reading, Dr. Jenna Hayes. She stood too straight to be purely civilian and kept one hand curled against the strap as if prepared to leave the instant she was unwelcome. "Do you have a minute, Dr. Hale?" Rowan looked up from a chart. "Come in." Hayes stepped inside and closed the door behind her with careful quiet. Her eyes flicked once to the visible side of Rowan's head, then to the photograph on the bookshelf, then back to Rowan's face. "I asked for this rotation," Hayes said. "All right, I did 2 deployments as a medic before med school." There it was. Not small talk. A declaration placed on the table like identification. Rowan leaned back slightly in her chair. "Anne," Hayes swallowed. "And sometimes I think everyone can tell before I open my mouth. Not that I served. That something is off, too flat, too sharp, too ready. I heard about you before I matched here. That is usually dangerous." Hayes gave a brief nervous laugh. "Probably. But I also heard you kept people like me from getting swallowed by this place." Rowan studied her a moment. The exhaustion around the eyes. The hypervigilant shoulders. The faint tension in the jaw of someone used to sleeping too lightly. Familiar enough to hurt. "This place is not the problem by itself," Rowan said. "The transition is." Hayes nodded too quickly, like the simple fact of being understood had knocked something loose. "I have not told many people," she admitted. "About the reserve. About the panic episodes after loud noise, about anything. I figured if I worked hard enough I could keep it separate." Rowan looked toward the window where late sun lay thin and gold over the tops of the city buildings. "I tried that. Did it work? For a while." Hayes waited. Rowan reached up and brushed the long side of her hair back from the scar. Not dramatically, not ceremonially, just enough to leave the line visible in full. "This did not end my career," she said. "It changed the shape of it. That matters. Not the same thing." Hayes exhaled as if she had been standing underwater. Rowan went on. "You do not owe everyone your history, but you also do not have to spend all your strength pretending you have none." For the first time since entering the office, Hayes' posture eased. "Thank you," she said. "Do not thank me yet. You still have to survive your first overnight trauma call here." Hayes smiled despite herself. "I have heard stories. They are all true, and none of them are flattering." When she left, Rowan sat a little longer with the office quiet around her, and recognized something she had not planned to become. Not just department chair, not only surgeon, not only veteran who had managed to walk back into medicine and keep walking. Bridge. People like Hayes needed one. That idea expanded faster than she expected. With Sloane's backing and Denise's practical genius, Rowan helped launch a support track for veteran clinicians and medics transitioning into civilian hospital work. Nothing sentimental. No speeches about heroism. Concrete things. Mentorship. Quiet mental health pathways that did not brand a career before it began. Orientation sessions that acknowledged trauma histories without reducing people to them. Protected check-ins after difficult cases. Direct language around body scars. Prosthetics, hearing loss, and all the ways war leaves a mark that institutions prefer to call irrelevant until it inconveniences them. Brooke became one of its fiercest organizers. Page built the curriculum piece that translated combat triage logic into civilian trauma teaching without fetishizing war. Tyler turned protocol review into a training packet so clear even emergency medicine attendings started stealing it. Nolan, to his credit, worked hardest where no one was clapping. He stayed late, took the ugliest calls, asked better questions. The first time he interrupted an attending from another service because the room was missing a hidden bleed pattern. Rowan was close enough to hear the steadiness in his voice, and far enough away not to rescue him. He held the line. The patient made it to the OR in time. Afterward, he found her at the scrub sink and said nothing for a moment, just stood there letting the water run over his wrists. "You heard it in time," Rowan said. He nodded. Then, with the faintest trace of the old arrogance now tempered into something almost useful, he said, "Turns out pride has better applications." She handed him a towel, only when leashed. Winter thinned toward spring. Snow retreated from the curbs. The first real rain came one night with enough force to drum against the trauma bay skylight and make 3 interns jump at once. Rowan did not. Not outwardly. The old charge still flickered through her system, but it no longer owned the room before she did. One evening, near the end of March, Luke texted, "Unit reunion next month, Colorado Springs. No excuses, Captain." Rowan read the message in her office with the desk lamp on, and the city reflecting back in the glass beyond her shoulder. For a moment, she thought of the old version of herself, the one who would have stared at the invitation until it expired, then told herself distance was dignity. That woman had survived by shrinking every bond into manageable pieces and calling isolation control. Rowan typed back, "I will be there." Luke replied almost instantly, "Good. They all hoped you would say yes." She smiled down at the screen and set the phone aside. When she left the office that night, the hospital had settled into the gentler half of evening. Fewer visitors. Lower voices. The floor mopped to a dull shine. She took the long way out without really deciding to and found herself in the main lobby, where Luke had first seen her and broken the seal on everything she had kept buried. The same front desk, the same rows of chairs, the same sliding doors opening to the city, but not the same woman crossing the floor. A transport aide nodded to her on his way past with an empty stretcher. Denise waved from the elevator bank and mouthed, "Eat something before you go." 2 residents from another service lowered their conversation as she passed, not from fear, but respect. No one stared at her hair. No one pretended not to see the scar. They saw the surgeon. At the doors, she paused and caught her reflection in the dark glass. Long hair on the left, close cropped on the right, pale line curving back above the ear. Tired eyes, steady mouth, a face no longer split between who she had been and who she was trying not to be. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Hayes. "Made it through my first trauma overnight without freezing. Thought you should know." Rowan typed back without hesitation. "Good. Get some sleep, then do it again." She slipped the phone into her coat pocket and stepped outside. Denver was cool and wind cut between the buildings with that clean mountain edge it kept even in warmer months. Traffic hissed over damp pavement. Somewhere, a siren moved downtown and faded. The city was alive in the ordinary, relentless way cities are full of people who would never know how close to ending and beginning one life can sit inside the same body. Rowan walked to her car under the wash of streetlights, the scar bare to the cold air, and for once the exposure did not feel like vulnerability. It felt like alignment. Not because the wound had become beautiful, not because the past had become easier, because she had finally stopped asking it to disappear before allowing herself to live in full view. Behind her, Granite Ridge glowed against the night, not as a temporary post anymore, but as a place she had chosen. A place where the room had once laughed, then listened, then changed. A place where she had arrived intending to leave no trace and had instead built something that would outlast her first contract, her first fear, even the first story people told about her. She got into the car and started the engine. In the rearview mirror, the city lights caught the line of the scar for one brief second before the angle shifted and the road took her forward.